Do you hear it, my king? The silence. It has a voice now, a presence in this great hall where once the rafters would ring with the boasts of your 100 sons. It is a hollow sound, isn't it? A wind that blows through the empty chambers of your heart. And in this deafening quiet, you ask me to speak. You ask me to unspool the entire, blood-soaked tapestry once more, from the very first thread. You, who saw it all through my eyes, who felt every blow and heard every dying gasp as I relate it to you, now you wish to hear it again, as if hearing it a second time might change the ending. As if you could pinpoint the precise moment the first drop of poison entered the wine, and in knowing find some measure of peace. You want to know where the sickness began. I understand. You seek a single point of blame in a history so tangled with mistakes that it resembles a knotted serpent. Very well. I will tell you. I will trace the venom from the deepest root to the bitter, ashen fruit it produced. But this story, this epic of our ruin, it does not begin with the scream of war conches on the fields of Kurukshetra. It does not start with the rattle of Shakuni's dice, or even with the ambitious cry of your firstborn son. No, my king. It begins with a promise. It begins with an act of sacrifice so pure, so noble, it became the most potent poison our dynasty would ever know. So, before we settle into this long night of memory, perhaps you, and those listening to this echo of the past, should take a moment. If you find value in these words, a like and a subscription are a quiet nod of encouragement. And if you are out there, in some distant land where the sun is just rising as our story sets, feel free to leave your city and your time in the comments. It is a strange comfort to know how far these whispers travel. Now let the shadows gather. The darkness is already in our hearts. Let us begin. Do you recall the tales they told of your great-grandfather, Shantanu? The bards sing of him as a titan, a king whose reign was a golden age. But the court records, the private scrolls I have read, they tell a different story. They speak of a man haunted by a ghost made of water. After the goddess of the river, Ganga, left him, taking their first 7 sons and leaving him only the 8th, the mighty river itself became a monument to his grief. You could feel it in the palace, a pervasive chill that had nothing to do with the seasons. He would walk the banks for hours, and the entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath, caught in the grip of his silent, aching loss. He gave Hastinapura order and wealth, but he filled its soul with his own cavernous emptiness. And an empty heart, my king, as you know better than any man alive, is a dangerously tempting vessel. It pleads to be filled, and it is rarely particular about what rushes in to fill the void. And so it was that he found her, Satyavati. Her skin held the scent of the river she called home, and her beauty was of a kind that could make a man forget his own name. But it was not her beauty that sealed our fate. It was her father, a fisherman, a man whose hands were calloused from mending nets and whose eyes held the shrewd, patient cunning of one who understands the currents and the tides. He looked upon the great king of the Kurus, the ruler of the known world, and he did not see a sovereign to be honored. He saw a man starving for affection. He saw your great-grandfather's loneliness, and he understood, with a clarity that would have humbled 1,000 court ministers, that this loneliness was the most valuable commodity in the entire kingdom. The price he named for his daughter's hand was not gold, or cattle, or land. It was the future. It was the throne. It was the birthright of the perfect prince, Devavrata. And Devavrata, the son Shantanu had been left, was the living embodiment of Dharma. He was strong, he was wise, he was the son to which the entire kingdom turned its face. He saw his father, this great king, reduced to a sighing shadow, consumed by a love that was denied him. And in the magnificent, tragic purity of his youth, he saw a simple problem that required a simple, selfless solution. He saw his father's heartache, and he decided he would build a dam to stop the tears, never realizing that in doing so, he was about to divert the entire river of our dynasty into a barren desert. He did not consult the elders. He did not consider the line of succession, the fragile chain of command that holds a kingdom together. He saw only his father's pain, and that was enough. He went to the fisherman's hut, a prince of the blood humbling himself before a commoner who smelled of fish and river mud. There, in that simple dwelling, he made the first cut into the heart of our family. I, Devavrata, he declared, renounce my claim to the throne of Hastinapura, The sons of Satyavati shall be kings after my father." A gasp must have gone through those who witnessed it. The kingdom's future, the stable, prosperous future everyone took for granted, was being sacrificed on the altar of a king's infatuation. But the fisherman was not a man easily moved by grand gestures. He mended nets for a living, my king. He knew that the smallest hole could undo the entire structure. "That is a noble vow, my prince," the fisherman said, his voice flat, devoid of the gratitude one might expect. "But what of your sons? They will be born of a lion's blood. They will be mighty warriors, true Kshatriyas. Who is to say that they will not one day look upon my daughter's children, sitting on the throne, and feel that an injustice was done? Who is to say they will not challenge for what they believe is their rightful place?" And there it was, the moment the poison was truly administered, the moment the rot took hold in the root. To quiet the fears of this calculating fisherman, to grant his grieving father this one last measure of happiness, Devavrata made the second vow. The vow that would echo through our history like a funeral bell. The vow that earned him the name Bhishma, the Terrible. He swore an oath of lifelong celibacy. He would never marry. He would never have children. The line of Shantanu through him would end. The scriptures say the heavens themselves trembled. The gods, in their distant realms, rained down flowers and hailed his monumental sacrifice. But what was it really when you strip away the poetry? It was the greatest man our lineage ever produced, the man most fit to rule, willingly locking himself in a prison of his own making. He became the eternal guardian of a throne he would never occupy, a protector of a lineage he was not allowed to continue. He chained himself to the idea of the crown and, in doing so, became its first and greatest slave. He constructed a cage out of his own honor and handed the key to his father, a man who merely sought a cure for a broken heart. He believed he was serving the dynasty, my king, but he was only serving the transient desires of the man who currently sat upon the throne. It is a fine distinction, but it is the crack upon which our entire palace eventually crumbled. Bhishma became a slave to his word, unable to bend even when it was breaking the kingdom. Just as you, my king, would one day become a slave to your affection for Duryodhana, unable to see the ruin he was building around you. The cage was locked that day by the riverbank, and the terrible truth is we were all trapped inside it with him. We just didn't know it yet. Satyavati, the fisherman's daughter, had her victory. Her bloodline now owned the throne. But fate, my king, possesses a sense of irony so cruel it borders on artistry. The very lineage she had secured at the cost of the kingdom's greatest asset turned out to be a dead end. Her first son, Chitrangada, was killed in a battle with a Gandharv, his reign a mere flicker. Her second, Vichitravirya, ascended the throne but was a pale, sickly boy who spent his days in the company of his wives and his nights wasting away from consumption. He died without leaving an heir. And just like that, the throne was empty. Satyavati, the queen mother, now presided over a dynasty that was gasping its last breath. The fisherman's grand bargain had brought the Kuru line to the very edge of extinction. Her ambition had purchased a crown for a ghost. In her panic, she went to the one man who could solve the problem. She went to Bhishma. She stood before the man who had sacrificed everything for her sake, and now she demanded he sacrifice the one thing he had left: his vow. "The dynasty is dying, Bhishma," she cried, her voice no longer that of a queen but of a desperate investor watching her fortune turn to dust. "You must save us. Take my son's widows as your wives. Give the kingdom an heir. It is your duty." She was talking to a mountain, a man who had so completely fused himself with his promise that he could no longer distinguish between his honor and his identity. He could have saved us all right then. With one act of pragmatic compromise, he could have sired a king and set the line right. But the bars of the cage he had built were too strong. He chose to preserve his personal oath over ensuring the survival of the entire race. Was that Dharma, my king? Or was it a form of pride so profound, so absolute, that it wore the mask of piety? He refused. The mountain would not move. And so, Satyavati was forced to play her final, hidden card. A secret from her youth, before she was a queen, before she had even met King Shantanu. A son, born of a union with a great sage, Parashara. This son was now a man, a rishi of immense power and fearsome asceticism. His name was Vyasa. She summoned him from his forest hermitage, a wild figure smelling of wood smoke and damp earth, his beard tangled, his eyes holding the unsettling wisdom of one who has stared into the heart of creation. He was her emergency plan, the ultimate compromise. There was an ancient custom, a sacred rite for such desperate times, called Nyoga. It allowed a childless widow to conceive a child with a chosen man, to continue the family line. But let us not hide behind holy words, my king. It was a political patch, a desperate measure wrapped in the cloth of tradition, born from Satyavati's terror of losing the kingdom she had so shrewdly acquired. I must tread carefully here, my king, for this is the story of your own conception. The sage Vyasa was formidable. His years of austerity had carved the wilderness into his very being. He was not a creature of the palace. When your mother, Ambika, Vichitraviriya's first widow, was sent into the chamber with him, she was overcome with terror. She did what any frightened young woman would do in the face of such a fearsome, otherworldly presence. She shut her eyes tight, a simple human act of fear, and from that act, a son was conceived who would never see the light of day. You were born of her refusal to see, my king. You were born into a physical darkness that would, in time, mirror a darkness of the soul. Your eyes were closed to the world from your first breath. Was it not a prophecy for the way you would later close your heart to the injustices unfolding right before you? Next, the second widow, Ambalika, was sent to him. Warned by her sister of the sage's terrifying appearance, she forced herself to keep her eyes open, but she could not control her fear. The blood drained from her face, and she became as pale as a ghost. And her son, Pandu, was born of that terror. He was born pale and sickly, with a constitutional weakness that would follow him all his life. And so, the kingdom had its heirs, the children of compromise, one marked by a permanent darkness, the other by a permanent frailty. Satyavati, ever the perfectionist, was still not satisfied. She begged her daughters-in-law to try again, but they were too terrified. Instead, they sent a maidservant in their place. This young woman, unafraid and bound by her duty, met the great sage not with terror, but with calm respect. And from her courage, from her acceptance, a perfect child was born. Vidura. He was healthy, strong, and blessed with a mind so brilliant and a heart so devoted to Dharma that he shone like a beacon. He was everything a king ought to be, but he could never be king, for his mother was a servant. And so we made our next great error. We cast aside true wisdom because of a rule about blood. We chose a prince who could not see and a prince who was too weak, over the one prince who could truly guide us. We valued the purity of a lineage over the purity of a man's character. For a time, it seemed our patchwork solution would hold. Pandu, though frail, was able to rule, and he ruled justly. Bhishma guided him, and the kingdom knew a fragile peace. But the fates had not finished their cruel design. One day, while hunting in the forest, Pandu shot a stag that was, in truth, a sage in disguise. With his dying breath, the sage laid a curse upon him. Should he ever embrace his wives, he would die instantly. Condemned to a life without intimacy, without the hope of fathering his own heirs, Pandu renounced the throne he had so ably managed. He retreated to the forest with his two wives, Kunti and Madri, leaving the kingdom in your hands. You were now the regent, my king. The seat of power was finally yours to warm, even if the crown itself was not. It was your first real taste of the authority you had always believed was your birthright, denied to you only by the accident of your blindness. And then, in the seclusion of that forest, a miracle occurred. While you and your queen, Gandhari, struggled for years to produce an heir in the opulent palace, your brother's wives called upon the gods. Kunti, using a boon she had received as a young woman, summoned the deities themselves to father her children. First, she called upon Dharma, the god of justice, and bore Yudhishthir. Then Vayu, the god of wind, and bore the mighty Bhima. Then Indra, the king of gods, who gave her the peerless Arjuna. Finally, she shared her boon with Madri, who bore the twin sons Nakula and Sahdeva from the divine physicians, the Ashvins. 5 sons, born of prayer and divine will, under the open sky, in the clean air of the wilderness. Your 100 sons, my king, would eventually be born of a mother's blindfolded devotion and a father's desperate, gnawing ambition, all within the suffocating, gilded walls of this very palace. The seeds of the Great War were not planted in a field. They were planted in the wombs of 2 generations of queens, one in light, the other in darkness. The dice of destiny were cast long before your son ever learned how to throw them. I was there the day they arrived in Hastinapura. After Pandu's death in the forest, Kunti brought his 5 sons back to the capital, back to the home that should have been theirs. I remember watching them stand in the great hall, 5 boys who looked as if they were carved from the forest itself. Their skin was browned by the sun, their movements had the easy grace of wild creatures, and their eyes held a quiet clarity that was unsettling in the perfumed, political air of the court. They looked like 5 strong, wild saplings brought into a formal, manicured garden. They looked at your 100 sons, with their pale skin and soft palace bodies, and all they saw were cousins, family they had never known. But your firstborn, Duryodhana, did not see cousins. He looked at them and saw an infestation. He saw interlopers who had come to steal the warmth of his father's affection and, one day, his throne. He saw Yudhishthir's innate righteousness and called it weakness. He saw Bhima's impossible, God-given strength and called it brutish arrogance. And when he saw Arjuna, who seemed to have been born with a bow in his hand, pick up a weapon and excel without effort, he saw a flame that had to be extinguished before it grew into a fire. The childhood contests began almost immediately. They were presented as games, simple tests of skill to forge brotherly bonds. But in our court, nothing was ever simple. Every foot race, every wrestling match, every archery contest became a battle for your approval, my king. And your approval was a river that flowed in only one direction, toward your son. When Bhima, with the power of the wind god in his limbs, would playfully best all 100 of your boys at once, you didn't hear the laughter of children. You heard only Duryodhana's subsequent whispers of complaint, his accusations of unfairness. You would call your son to your side, your hands, your eyes, tracing the proud, resentful lines of his face, and you would soothe him with promises of his own greatness. You watered the seeds of his envy with your validation, my king. You praised his unbending pride, and you mistook that fatal flaw for the strength of a future king. Your love became a shield, protecting him not from the world, but from the truth of his own character. Then came the poison. It was not a crime of passion, an angry lash-out in the heat of a game. It was a cold, deliberate thing. Duryodhana, your pride, the heir to your throne, invited his cousin Bhima to a picnic by the river. With his own hands, he served Bhima a meal laced with a potent, fast-acting poison. He smiled as his cousin ate. He watched as the strong boy's eyes glazed over and he collapsed to the ground. Then, with the help of his brothers, he bound the unconscious Bhima with vines and rolled his body into the sacred waters of the Ganges, leaving him for the currents to claim. This was not a playground squabble, my king. This was a dress rehearsal for fratricide. It was Duryodhana testing the limits of his own darkness, pushing the boundaries to see what he could get away with. And you, my king, when Bhima miraculously returned, saved by the Nagas in their underwater kingdom, you listened to your son's flimsy excuses and you chose to see what you wanted to see. You called it a regrettable accident, a boyish prank gone wrong. You did not punish him. You did not correct him. You simply held him closer, reassured him of your love. In that moment of misplaced affection, you taught your son the most dangerous lesson a prince can ever learn. That for him, there would be no consequences. Into this simmering pot of jealousy and favoritism, Bhishma, ever the dutiful guardian, introduced a new, volatile ingredient, Dronacharya, a master of the arts of war, a Brahmin whose skill with weapons was the stuff of legend. We all thought he would be a force for order. We believed his rigorous discipline would forge these 13 princes, the 5 Pandavas and your eldest sons, into a single, unbreakable brotherhood of warriors. We were fools. Drona was not a teacher interested in unity. He was a man nursing a deep and bitter grudge against King Drupada of Panchala, a childhood friend who had later humiliated him. He came to our court not to build a family, but to forge a weapon. He looked upon the princes not as his students, but as potential instruments for his personal revenge. And in Arjuna, he found his perfect instrument. The boy was a phenomenon. His concentration was absolute. While the other princes slept, he would be out in the dark, practicing his aim by the sound of the target alone. Drona saw his own burning ambition mirrored in Arjuna's singular focus, and he showered him with praise and special instruction. He loved Arjuna, but every word of praise Drona uttered was like a drop of acid on Duryodhana's soul. He did not see Drona's favor as a just reward for Arjuna's relentless dedication. He saw it as a theft, an injustice. In the world your son was building inside his own mind, all glory, all praise, all power belonged to him by birthright alone. It was a lesson he had learned sitting at your knee, my king, in the darkness of your embrace. Do you remember the story of Eklavya, the tribal boy? I reported it to you myself. A young hunter from the deep forests who, having been denied instruction by Drona, fashioned a clay statue of the master and taught himself. In his raw talent and pure devotion, he became an archer whose skill rivaled, and perhaps even surpassed, Arjuna's. When Drona discovered this prodigy, did he celebrate his dedication? Did he welcome this brilliant young man? No. He saw only a threat to the promise he had made that Arjuna would be the greatest archer in the world. So he used the boy's own reverence against him. He asked for his guru's fee, his gurudakshina, and as his fee he demanded the boy's right thumb. And Eklavya, in his heartbreaking, noble innocence, drew his knife and severed his own future, offering the bloody digit to the man he revered. Drona crippled a genius to protect the status of his favorite. That was the kind of justice we were teaching your sons. A justice that serves the powerful and mutilates the inconvenient. Finally, the day of the public exhibition arrived. The graduation ceremony for the princes. A grand tournament for them to display their hard-won skills before the court and the citizens. The entire capital was buzzing with excitement. But it was never truly about skill. It was a stage, carefully set for the public performance of Duryodhana's envy and Arjuna's pride. We all gathered in the arena, expecting a day of entertainment. We did not understand that we were about to witness the formal drawing of the battle lines that would one day divide our kingdom. The arrival of Drona did not unite the cousins. It simply gave their simmering hatred a sharper edge, a more effective and deadly aim. He taught them all how to be perfect warriors, my king. But he never once taught them how to be brothers. My tone grows heavier now, my king, as I guide you into the memory of that hall. For after the Pandavas escaped the house you had gifted them, a beautiful palace built of lac and resin, another of your sons' imaginative pranks, that somehow involved an assassination plot and a plan to burn them all alive in their sleep. They rose from what should have been their own funeral pyre, guided by their cousin, Krishna, and blessed by the gods they so honored. They were given a barren, forgotten piece of land to call their own. And upon that wasteland, they built Indraprastha. You heard the reports. I brought them to you myself, reading from the scrolls my spies sent back. It was a city of impossible beauty, a marvel of architecture and magic so perfect it was said to be a jewel dropped from the crown of Indra himself. Its markets were filled with the wealth of the world. Its halls echoed with poetry and music, and its justice was so true that the poorest citizen felt like a king. Every report of its splendor, every story of its prosperity, was a hot coal on Duryodhana's heart. It was not enough that he possessed the great ancestral kingdom of Hastinapura. He could not bear that his cousins possessed anything. His envy, the little seedling you had so carefully watered with your praise, had now grown into a monstrous, thorny vine, and it was choking the very life out of him. And so he came to you, not with a call to arms, for he knew Bhishma would never allow an open war against the rightful heirs. He came with something far more subtle, far more corrosive. A game of dice. The idea had been whispered into his ear by his uncle, that venomous serpent from Gandhara, Shakuni. You cannot defeat them with the sword, nephew, that creature hissed, for they are protected by the gods. But you can destroy them with their own virtue. And you, my king, you consented. Oh, you performed a masterful scene for Vidura when he came to you, his face etched with worry. You listened to his desperate pleas, his wise warnings that gambling was the gateway to ruin for any noble house. You nodded your head gravely and spoke of Dharma, but your heart was already with your son. You gave your royal sanction to the trap while assuring your wise brother that you were merely promoting a friendly family reunion. It was the first of the great lies you told, not just to your court, but to your own soul. And so Yudhishthir came. He knew. You could see the resignation in his eyes as he walked into the newly constructed gaming hall. He knew it was a snare, but he was bound by the Kshatriya code. To refuse a challenge from another king, especially a challenge issued by his own sovereign, was an act of dishonor he could not commit. That was the diabolical genius of Shakuni's plan. It used Yudhishthir's greatest strength, his unwavering commitment to his duty, as the weapon that would destroy him. The hall was thick with a silence that felt heavier than stone. The only sound was the sharp, dry clatter of Shakuni's ivory dice upon the wooden board. It was not the sound of chance, my king. It was precise, controlled, malevolent. It sounded like small bones breaking one by one. With every throw, Shakuni would let out a dry, rasping laugh. "Ah, I win," he would say, and your son and his brothers would erupt in cheers. They were not merely winning a game. They were reveling in the slow, methodical vivisection of a good man's life. He lost his pearls, his chests of gold, his herds of cattle. He lost his chariots and his legions of soldiers. He lost his magnificent city, Indraprastha, the one whose gleam had so tormented your son. With each devastating loss, a deeper gloom fell over the assembly. I looked to Bhishma, my king, the great-grandsire, the protector of our dynasty's honor. He sat as still as his own effigy, his eyes fixed on the polished floor, as if he could find the answer to this horror in the reflection of the rafters. I looked to Drona, the great teacher of arms. He stared at his own hands in his lap, as if they were foreign objects he had never seen before. They were all there, the great men of our age, paralyzed. Paralyzed by their oaths of loyalty to the throne you sat upon. They saw evil, pure and undiluted, unfolding before them, and they chose to honor their employment contracts instead of their conscience. Their silence was a verdict, my king. It declared to the whole world that loyalty to you, the blind king, was a higher virtue than loyalty to Dharma itself. Then the unthinkable happened. Having lost all material possessions, Yudhishthir, in his desperation, staked his brothers. First Nakula, then Sahdeva, then the mighty Arjuna, the pride of the gods, and finally Bhima, the pillar of their strength. With each roll of the dice, your son's laughter grew louder, crueler, more unhinged. They were like jackals tearing at a fallen lion. And then, having nothing left in all the world, Yudhishthir staked himself. The dice rolled, Shakuni cackled, and the 5 sons of Pandu, grandsons of Vyasa, beloved of the gods, became your son's personal property. They became his slaves. Duryodhana rose, his chest puffed out with a pride so monstrous it seemed to suck the very air from the hall. He had not earned a kingdom. He had not conquered it. He had stolen it with loaded dice and a hollow promise of sport. But his cruelty, his insatiable need to humiliate, was not yet satisfied. To own their bodies was not enough. He wanted to pulverize their souls. And so he gave the order, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. Go, bring the woman, bring Draupadi. Let her sweep the floors with the other serving maids. My blood ran cold, my king. The entire court gasped as one. To summon a queen, the lawfully wedded wife of kings, into a public assembly hall filled with men, especially when she was in her monthly seclusion. It was an act of profound, unspeakable defilement. Your brother, Dushasana, his eyes alight with a rabid glee, dragged her into the hall by her hair. But even with her royal sari in disarray and tears of outrage streaming down her face, she did not beg for mercy. She did not plead. She challenged. Her voice, clear and sharp, cut through the cowardly silence. She posed a question of Dharma so precise and devastating that it struck at the very heart of our hypocrisy. I ask this assembly of elders, she declared. Did the king lose himself first, or did he lose me? For if he had already lost his own freedom and become a slave, what right did a slave have to wager me? Silence, my king. A deep, shameful, cowardly silence was the only answer she received. The greatest minds of the age, the guardians of our sacred laws, the mighty warriors Bhishma and Drona, the wise Vidura, all were struck dumb. They could not answer. They could not answer because the only truthful answer would be to condemn the entire proceeding, to condemn your son, and by extension, to condemn you, the king, who sat there and allowed this abomination to occur. So they chose their comfort over her honor. They chose to protect their positions over protecting the truth. In that moment of collective cowardice, we were all exposed for what we had become. A collection of weak-willed sycophants, presided over by a blind man who had long ago chosen not to see. And then Duryodhana, seeing the elders falter, gave the final, unforgivable command. He looked at his brother, his face a mask of pure hatred, and said, "Strip her." He commanded Dushasana to disrobe the queen of Indraprastha in front of her husbands, her elders, and the entire court. And Dushasana, laughing, obeyed. He grabbed the end of her sari and he pulled. She closed her eyes. She did not pray to Bhishma or Drona. She had seen the hollowness of their honor. She prayed to Krishna. And as Dushasana pulled and pulled, a miracle happened in your court that day. The cloth kept coming. It unspooled and unspooled. An endless river of fabric, piling up on the floor around her. A vibrant mountain of silk that grew into a monument to your son's depravity and her unwavering faith. A god had to intervene in our assembly hall, my king, because every single man there had utterly failed in his duty. Dushasana finally collapsed in exhaustion, defeated by a piece of cloth. And in the stunned silence that followed, a new sound emerged. Not a word, but a roar. A sound of such primal rage it seemed to shake the foundations of the palace. It was Bhima. I saw his eyes, my king. They were no longer human. They were burning coals of incandescent fury. And he made his vow. He swore that one day he would tear open Dushasana's chest with his bare hands and drink his blood. He swore that he would find Duryodhana on the battlefield and shatter the very thighs that he had so arrogantly exposed to the queen. These were not the desperate, angry words of a defeated man. They were a prophecy. It was the sound of an unbreakable bond of kinship shattering into a million pieces, and in its place, a blood feud being consecrated for all time. Only then, my king, only when you saw the evil omens, the howling of jackals outside the palace, the eclipsing of the sun, only when you feared the supernatural wrath that your son's actions had unleashed, only then did you finally speak. You offered Draupadi boons. You gave the Pandavas back their freedom, their weapons, their kingdom. It was a futile gesture, a desperate attempt to wash the blood from your hands after the murder was already complete. But the wound was too deep. The humiliation had been burned into their souls. The hatred had been forged and tempered in that hall. When Dushasana's hands first reached for her sari, it was not a princess who was shamed. It was the entire Kuru dynasty. And in your silence, my king, you gave your consent. The war was won and lost in that single silent moment. Your son, predictably, could not leave well enough alone. The fear of their inevitable return, armed and with a righteous cause, gnawed at him. He came to you again with Shakuni at his side, and convinced you to invite Yudhishthir back for one final, friendly game of dice. The terms were absolute, stripped of any pretense of sport. The loser would go into exile for 12 years in the forest, followed by a 13th year in which they must live in disguise, completely incognito. If they were discovered during that 13th year, the entire cycle of exile would begin again. Yudhishthir, ever the slave to his word, accepted the challenge. And he lost. Of course, he lost. The dice were never the point. The game was merely a flimsy legal justification for the theft that had already occurred. I watched them leave the city, stripped of their royal finery, clad in simple garments of bark and deerskin. They walked out of the main gates of Hastinapura. But they did not walk as defeated men. They walked with their heads held high, their faces set with a grim resolve. Draupadi, her long, beautiful hair unbound, a public symbol of her vow that it would not be tied again until it was washed in the blood of Dushasana, did not shed a single tear. Their departure had more majesty, more true royalty in it, than Duryodhana's triumphant procession to the throne ever would. We had cast out our conscience, my king. We had exiled our own dharma. And then we had the audacity to celebrate our own decay. And what were those 13 years like for us? Here in the gilded halls of Hastinapura. It was a long, slow poisoning of the spirit. Duryodhana sat upon a stolen throne, and the guilt made every shadow in the palace look like an assassin. He was consumed by paranoia. Spies were sent out constantly, not to monitor the borders for foreign enemies, but to scour the forests, hunting for any sign of his cousins. The court, once a place of vibrant debate led by men like Vidura, became a den of sycophants and flatterers, all competing to tell your son what he wanted to hear. Vidura's wise counsel was ridiculed and ignored, replaced by the venomous whispers of Shakuni and the brooding, ambitious silence of Karna. We were rich, yes. The vast treasury of Indraprastha now filled our coffers. But the soul of our kingdom was bankrupt. We were living in a beautifully decorated tomb, and we were all slowly suffocating. And what of them out in the wilderness? The reports my spies brought back told a very different story. You would hear them and dismiss them as tales of hardship, and you seemed to take comfort in that. You wanted to hear that they were starving, that they were broken, that they were being forgotten by the world. But that is not what I saw through my agent's eyes. I saw Yudhishthir, sitting at the feet of the great sages who lived in the forest, his understanding of Dharma deepening from a king's duty to a cosmic truth. I saw Bhima, his boundless energy no longer wasted on palace games, wrestling with forest demons and channeling his rage into a focused, formidable strength. They were not being diminished by their hardship, my king. They were being purified by it. They were being stripped of all distractions, all luxuries, and were being forged into something harder, purer, and infinitely more dangerous. And Arjuna undertook a pilgrimage that took him beyond the world of men. He journeyed into the Himalayas, where he performed severe austerities, meditating until he earned the attention of the gods. He wrestled with Lord Shiva himself and, in return for his courage, was granted the Pasapatastra, a celestial weapon of unimaginable power. He then ascended to the heavens of Indra, his divine father, and spent years training, mastering the use of weapons that could end creation itself. While your son was in his armory, counting his chariots and sharpening his mortal blades, Arjuna was in the heavens, collecting apocalypses. He was preparing for a war of righteousness. We were merely preparing for a war of numbers. It was a fool's calculation from the very beginning. Do you remember the story I told you of the enchanted pool, from the later years of their exile? When his 4 mighty brothers, one by one, fell dead on the shore, slain by the invisible yaksha who guarded the water, simply because they ignored the spirit's questions in their haste to quench their thirst. Yudhishthir arrived last. He saw his dead brothers, yet he did not give in to rage or despair. He calmly and respectfully answered every one of the yaksha's profound riddles, questions about life, death, and the nature of dharma. He demonstrated that his true strength was not in his arms, but in his unshakable moral intellect. He earned his brothers' lives back not through violence, but through wisdom. Tell me, my king, if Duryodhana had been the first to arrive at that pool, what would the outcome have been? He would have shouted insults at the invisible spirit, swung his mace at the water, and all 100 of your sons would have ended up as corpses by a quiet pool in the woods. Then came the final year, the 13th year, the year they had to live in disguise. They found refuge in the court of King Virata. And the humility they endured was their final, most difficult test. The righteous Emperor Yudhishthir, now a courtier named Kanka, advising a provincial king on the proper way to play dice. The mighty Bhima, whose strength could shake the earth, now a royal cook named Balaba, his mace-wielding hands covered in flour. And Arjuna, the greatest warrior in the world, the companion of gods, living as a eunuch named Brihanala, teaching the royal princess how to sing and dance. The sheer, unbending discipline it must have taken to hold all that power, all that righteous fury for the injustices they had suffered, and to keep it perfectly hidden beneath a cloak of servitude. It was the deep, silent drawing back of the bowstring just before the arrow is loosed. But even that iron discipline had its breaking point. When the queen's brother, the arrogant General Kachaka, laid his lustful hands on Draupadi, who was serving as the queen's handmaiden, she did not appeal to King Virata for justice. Justice had already failed her once in a hall full of kings. In the dead of night, Bhima, the royal cook, met Kachaka in the empty dance hall. He did not simply kill him. He unmade him. He broke every bone in Kachaka's body and crushed him into a shapeless ball of flesh and bone, a thing so unrecognizable that his own family could not identify the remains. It was a message, my king, a terrifying promise of the violence that had been simmering for 12 long years, now served cold. And then you, my king, you sanctioned the final act of supreme folly. On the advice of Duryodhana, who was certain he could expose the Pandavas in the final days of their exile, you approved a cattle raid on Virata's kingdom. Your son was giddy with the plan. He would expose them, prove they had been found, and force them into another 13 years of exile. He brought everyone, Bhishma, Drona, Karna, Ashvathama. The entire, overwhelming might of the Kuru army was marched to the border of a small provincial kingdom, all to steal some cows and finally shame his cousins into oblivion. He got his wish. He found them. After our forces had easily defeated the Matsya army, he found Arjuna, the palace dance teacher, serving as the charioteer for the young, terrified Prince Uttara. And on that day, my king, on the plains outside Virata's city, one man, after a year of living as less than a man, single-handedly defeated our entire, assembled army. He used a celestial weapon that put our greatest warriors to sleep. He humbled the great Bhishma. He disarmed his own teacher, Drona. He shamed the mighty Karna, stealing his pride along with his fine clothes. He utterly shattered the arrogance of Duryodhana, sending him fleeing from the field in disgrace. It was a clear, unambiguous warning from the gods themselves, a final, terrifying demonstration of the power you had set against yourself. They had not been wasting away in the wilderness, my king. They had been sharpening themselves into divine weapons. And all of us, in our blind arrogance, failed to see it until it was too late. The exile was over. The 13 years had passed. The vow had been fulfilled down to the last humiliating second. A wave of relief washed over the good people of the land, my king. There was a sense in the air that the long winter was over, that justice, like the spring, would now inevitably prevail. The Pandavas, having proven their honor and their formidable power, sent their first, polite envoy. Their demand was not for war, not for revenge. It was simple. It was just, return what is ours, the message said. Return our half of the kingdom. Return Indraprastha. They had paid the terrible price that was demanded of them, and now they had come to collect the debt that was owed. It was a matter of law, of dharma. Even a common merchant expects to be repaid what he is owed. I was in the hall when your son received their message. He laughed, a loud, booming laugh that held no joy, only a deep, echoing contempt. Return it? He scoffed, his voice carrying across the silent court. They left here as beggars, and they have returned as beggars. For 13 years, I have ruled this land. I have managed its affairs. It is mine. Mine by possession, mine by right. He spoke as if he had built Indraprastha with his own hands, not stolen it with Shakuni's dice. In 13 years, he had managed to convince himself that the spoils of a rigged game were the just rewards of a righteous king. Your son had become the hero of his own magnificent lie. The elders tried. Bhishma, his voice heavy with the weariness of a century, pleaded with him. Do not mistake their patience for weakness, my boy, he warned. You are inviting a storm that will swallow us all. Drona, his own teacher, cautioned him, reminding him of the divine weapons Arjuna now possessed. Even your queen, Gandhari, who had shared your darkness for all her married life, removed her blindfold in the privacy of her chambers to beg her firstborn to choose peace. My son, she pleaded, a kingdom of peace is far greater than any kingdom of land. But he was deaf to all of them. Your unwavering love had become a fortress around his heart, insulating him from the arrows of wisdom. He heard their warnings not as the counsel of wise men, but as the frightened ramblings of old cowards. And then Krishna came, the last, best hope for peace. When he walked into the assembly hall of Hastinapura, a profound hush fell over us all. It was not his royal attire or his growing reputation as a divine being that silenced us. It was the absolute, unshakable clarity in his eyes. He looked at the greed, the fear, the simmering violence that filled our court, and he was utterly unimpressed by it. He brought with him the clean, simple air of truth, and for those of us who had grown accustomed to breathing the poisoned atmosphere of your son's ambition, it was almost suffocating. He did not begin by demanding the return of Indraprastha. He did not list the litany of injustices. The rigged game, the humiliation of the queen, the attempted murder in the house of Lac, the 13 years of stolen life. He spoke only of peace, of the horror of a war between kinsmen. And then he made the offer that will be spoken of by historians for 1,000 years as the last chance our civilization had to save itself. To avoid the slaughter of brothers and uncles and teachers, Krishna said, his voice calm and steady as a deep river, the sons of Pandu will be satisfied with just 5 villages. One for each brother, a place for them to live in peace and honor as Kshatriyas. 5 villages, my king, not a kingdom, not a city, not even a town. 5 small clusters of huts, a handful of dust. It was a gesture of such profound humility, such a deep desire for peace, that it was almost painful to witness. He was offering your son a golden bridge to walk away from the war he seemed so determined to start. I watched your son's face as he listened. For a brief, flickering moment, I thought I saw a crack in the armor of his pride. I thought reason might find a foothold. But then he glanced over at Shakuni, and the serpent smiled his thin, poisonous smile. And Duryodhana stood. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried the chilling finality of a gravedigger's shovel hitting stone. 5 villages? He said, a sneer playing on his lips. Envoy, you mistake my generosity for weakness. I will not give the Pandavas so much as a speck of land that can be picked up on the point of a needle. Not without a war. And there it was, the final choice. He would rather burn the entire world to the ground than grant his cousins a single grain of sand to live on. But his madness, his divine arrogance, did not end there. In a fit of supreme folly, he gave his guards the order to arrest the envoy, to put chains on Krishna. It was in that moment that we all truly understood that we were no longer dealing with a political dispute. This was a battle against sanity itself. Krishna laughed, a sound that was not of this world, a sound that contained the rumbling of distant galaxies. And for a moment, the assembly hall dissolved around us. He gave us a glimpse of his universal form, his Vishvarupa. I saw it, my king. I saw suns and moons and entire universes swirling within his being. I saw all the gods and all the demons, and I saw the future. I saw our entire army, your 100 sons, Bhishma, Drona, Karna, all of us, marching like moths into the fiery maw of his mouth. He showed us our own annihilation. He showed us the pre-written, inescapable conclusion to the path your son had chosen. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. He was just a man in a king's court again. But none of us who saw it could ever unsee it. We had seen the face of destiny, and it was not smiling upon the house of Kuru. He walked out of the hall. No one dared to stop him. And as he passed through the great gates of the city, it felt as if the sun itself had gone with him. Hope, my king, was a physical presence in our city that day, and we had just politely, arrogantly shown it the door. Krishna offered your son 5 villages. Your son offered him war. And you, my king, the only man in the world who held the authority to command him, to force him to step back from the abyss, you offered him only your continued, loving silence. When Krishna departed, it was not just an envoy that left our city. It was our salvation. The war drums began to beat that day, a low, steady pulse that would not stop until they were finally silenced by the cries of 1,000,000 dying men. And so they came. From every corner of the land, the armies marched, a tide of humanity pulled by the gravity of our family's failure. Kings bound by ancient alliances, warriors sworn to oaths of loyalty, and common men conscripted by duty all converged on the sacred plain of Kurukshetra. From the divine sight granted to me by the sage Vyasa, it looked as if 2 great oceans of men, one dark and one light, had gathered to crash upon each other in a final world-breaking storm. The dust raised by their 1,000,000 feet blotted out the midday sun. The sound of their movements, the clatter of 1,000,000 weapons and the murmur of 1,000,000 voices, was a constant, low thunder that vibrated in the very bones of the earth. An entire generation of the kingdom's fathers, sons, and brothers, gathered together in one place for the sole, mad purpose of making widows and orphans of each other's families. I described the scene to you then as I see it in my mind now, my king. I told you of our own vast legions, 11 divisions strong, an unstoppable force. At its head was the grandsire Bhishma, the greatest warrior of the age, his banner a stark white against the blood-red earth. Beside him was Drona, their own teacher, the master of every weapon known to man, and Karna, whose skill was said to rival Arjuna's own. On the scrolls of military strategists we were invincible. Their army was smaller, only 7 divisions. But as I looked into their ranks, I saw no such division of the heart as was present in ours. Our leaders, Bhishma and Drona, loved the men they were honor-bound to kill. Their army stood as one, their eyes fixed on your son's banners with a singular, unified purpose. They were not fighting for land anymore. They were fighting for their queen's stolen honor, for their father's sullied name, for 13 years of a stolen life. We had the numbers, my king, but they had the cause. The conch shells, the great horns of war, were raised to the lips of 1,000,000 warriors. The moment of cataclysm was upon us. But then, a request. Arjuna, his face ashen, asked his charioteer, Krishna, to drive him into the center of the field. I wish to see those with whom I must contend in this strife of battle, he said, his voice barely a whisper. And so the golden chariot, a beacon of light in that grim expanse, rolled into the no man's land, into the valley of the shadow of death that separated the two armies. And he looked to his right and he looked to his left. And what did he see, my king? He saw his great-grandfather, Bhishma, the man who had bounced him on his knee as a child and told him stories of heroes. He saw his revered teacher, Drona, the man who had placed his first bow in his hand and praised his divine talent. He saw his cousins, his brothers, the playmates with whom he had grown up, their faces now grim, their familiar hands now holding weapons aimed at his heart. This was not an abstract war against a faceless enemy from a foreign land. This was the systematic murder of his own family, and the sheer, soul-crushing horror of it broke him. His mighty bow, the celestial Gandiva, slipped from his grasp. His legs gave way. He slumped to the floor of his chariot, a warrior undone not by a weapon, but by love. I will not fight, Krishna, he whispered, the words choked with despair. I see no good in killing my own kinsman in battle. And then, as the two armies waited in stunned silence, as the fate of the entire age hung in the balance, Krishna spoke. A conversation took place in that chariot that held the entire universe in abeyance. With my divine sight, I did not just hear the words, my king, I felt their cosmic weight. This was no mere pep talk to rally a soldier's courage. It was a fundamental realignment of the universe. Krishna spoke of duty, of the immortal soul that cannot be slain, of the necessity of action without attachment to its fruits. He was not just comforting a grieving nephew. He was reminding Arjuna that this war was no longer his personal struggle. It was a cosmic necessity, a painful, terrible, but desperately needed surgery to excise the cancer of adharma that your son had so carefully cultivated in the very heart of our kingdom. In that moment, listening to the echoes of that divine discourse, I finally realized the utter futility of our preparations. We had gathered our armies, polished our shields, and sharpened our blades, believing we were the masters of our fate. But we were merely pieces on a divine board, and the game had been set long ago, in a fisherman's hut, in a hall of loaded dice, in the silent complicity of a blind king. This was not a war that could be won by superior numbers or even by the prowess of legendary warriors. It was a war that could only be won by the side of righteousness. And righteousness was sitting in a golden chariot, calmly holding the reins, guiding the hand of its chosen champion. When Krishna finished speaking, Arjuna stood up. The doubt was gone from his eyes, but it was not replaced by the fire of hatred. It was replaced by a terrible, sorrowful resolve. He lifted the Gandiva. His hands did not tremble. He was no longer a nephew preparing to fight an uncle, or a student preparing to fight a teacher. He was an instrument of fate, grimly accepting his bitter and necessary role. He nodded once to Krishna, and the conch shells finally sounded. All across the plain, 1,000,000 shells blared in a deafening, unified chorus. It was not a sound of courage or glory, my king. It was the sound of a promise of mass death. It was the scream of a dying age. As Arjuna drew his first arrow, I saw it all. I saw the end. Not just the end of the battle, but the end of everything we had ever known. And it was your family on both sides of the field that held the torch to the funeral pyre of the world. For 10 days, my king, it was Bhishma's war. He was not a man. He was a hurricane of arrows, a white-bearded, white-bannered angel of destruction. He moved through the Pandava army like death itself, unstoppable, untouchable. He kept his promise to your son. He would not personally slay the 5 Pandava brothers, but he would annihilate their army at a rate of 10,000 men a day. And he nearly did. Each night, as I reported the devastating losses to you, I could hear the grim satisfaction in your voice, the hope that this tide of death would simply wash your problem away. But I also saw the truth of the battlefield. Bhishma was fighting with all the unmatched skill of his body, but with none of the conviction of his soul. He was a perfect weapon, wielded by an unworthy hand, and the deep, unspoken sorrow of it made his terrible prowess all the more tragic to behold. On the 9th day, Arjuna's continued reluctance to fight his beloved grandsire with his full force became too much for even a god to bear. As Bhishma once again tore through the Pandava ranks, scattering them like leaves, Krishna's divine patience snapped. He, who had vowed not to lift a weapon in this war, leaped from the chariot, seizing a discarded chariot wheel and holding it aloft like a discus. His face was a mask of celestial fury. He was going to end Bhishma himself, to force the hand of destiny. It took a terrified Arjuna, shocked back into action, to physically tackle him and plead with him to stop, reaffirming his own vow to fight. But the message was clear to all who witnessed it. This war had to be won, and the laws of men, even the sacred vows of gods, could be bent to serve the ultimate, unforgiving law of Dharma. That night, the Pandavas knew they could not win by conventional means. Bhishma was simply invincible, and so, they sought an unconventional solution. Krishna reminded them of Bhishma's own, lifelong vow. He would never raise a weapon against a woman, or against one who had once been a woman. And in the Pandava army stood Shikhandi, the reincarnation of the Princess Amba, a soul who had been reborn as a man for the sole purpose of causing Bhishma's death. This, my king, was the first true crack in the armor of the righteous war. To defeat the undefeatable, they were about to use a man's own code of honor as a loophole to kill him. It was a lawyer's trick, a sophist's argument, played out with swords and arrows. On the 10th day they put the plan into action. Arjuna placed Shikhandi at the front of his chariot, as a human shield. Seeing Shikhandi a warrior he could not, in honor, attack, Bhishma lowered his great bow. I saw his face in that moment, my king. It was not a face of fear or surprise. It was a face of weary, profound acceptance. He knew his time had come, and perhaps he even welcomed it. And from behind this shield Arjuna, his own beloved grandson, the boy he had taught and protected and loved above all others, let his arrows fly. It was not a battle. It was an execution. One arrow after another found its mark, until the great-grandsire was pierced by so many shafts that when he fell, his body did not touch the ground. He rested upon a bed made of the arrows of the man he loved most in the world. The first great pillar of our dynasty had been brought down by a technicality. With Bhishma gone, command of our army passed to Drona. And the very character of the war changed. If Bhishma's battle was a noble, tragic storm, Drona's was a cold, efficient, grinding machine. He was a scientist of warfare. He created impenetrable military formations, most notably the Chakravyuha, the spinning wheel of death, a multi-layered, moving labyrinth of soldiers that was a puzzle only a handful of warriors in the world knew how to solve completely. The war became less about individual heroism and more about brutal, inescapable logistics. And in that labyrinth, my king, our side committed its most heinous and cowardly act of the war. They used the formation to lure in Arjuna's young son, the valiant boy Abhimanyu. He had learned from his father how to break into the formation, but not how to escape it. Once he was trapped, alone, deep inside the churning wheel of our army, the rules of war were abandoned. Your son, Karna, Drona himself, and 5 other great Maharathis, great warriors, set upon the boy all at once. 7 celebrated heroes against one 16-year-old child. They broke his bow from behind. They killed his horses and his charioteer. They shattered his chariot. And when he stood on the ground, weaponless and exhausted, using a chariot wheel as a shield, they closed in and killed him. That was the measure of our honor on the 13th day of the war. Drona's grief for Abhimanyu, whom he had loved as a student, was overshadowed only by his fierce love for his own son, Ashvathama. And Krishna, ever the divine pragmatist, saw this love as Drona's fatal weakness. A new, darker plan was hatched. Bhima found and killed a mighty war elephant that was named Ashvathama. He then began to proclaim loudly across the battlefield, "Ashvathama is dead." Drona's heart faltered, but he could not bring himself to believe it. He turned to the one man in the universe he knew would never, ever tell a lie, Yudhishthir. "Is my son truly dead?" he called out across the chaos. And your nephew, the very embodiment of Dharma, spoke the words that would stain his soul for the rest of his life. "Ashvathama is dead," he said loudly and clearly. Then he whispered, so quietly that almost no one could hear, the elephant. But it was at that exact moment that Krishna had a conch shell blown, and the whisper was lost in the blast. Drona heard only the lie he most feared. It was enough. The truth was deliberately, strategically sacrificed for the sake of victory. Believing his son was dead, that his entire world had been destroyed, Drona laid down his weapons in the middle of his chariot and fell into a deep, grief-stricken meditation. His war was over, and Drishtadyumna, Draupadi's brother, a man whose very birth was for the sole purpose of avenging his father's humiliation at Drona's hands, seized the opportunity. He leaped onto the motionless chariot and, ignoring the desperate pleas of everyone around him, drew his sword and beheaded his own unarmed guru. We had used deceit to kill our teacher, my king. And with that act, all pretense of a righteous war vanished. All rules were broken. It was no longer a war of warriors. It became a hunt of wolves. And so, command passed to Karna. At last, this was the moment your son had been waiting for, the moment he believed would secure his final victory. The grand, strategic war was over. It had now become a deeply personal feud between two men who were, though they did not yet know it, brothers. When Karna rode out as the supreme commander, adorned in the golden, divine armor he had been born with, he shone like a vengeful sun. And his only purpose, his only desire, was to permanently eclipse the star of Arjuna. But first, the debt for Abhimanyu's death had to be paid. Arjuna, consumed by a grief so profound it had burned away all his hesitation and forged him into an instrument of cold fury, swore a terrible oath. He would kill Jayadratha, the man who had used a boon to hold back the other 4 Pandavas and prevent them from entering the Chakravyuha, before sunset on the following day. If he failed, he would walk into a fire and immolate himself. Your son was overjoyed. He saw a path to victory without even having to face Arjuna in a fair fight. The entire strategic focus of our massive army was bent to a single, simple purpose: to keep one man, Jayadratha, alive and hidden for one day. I have never seen anything like the battle that followed, my king. Arjuna fought like a man possessed by 10,000 demons of vengeance. He was a blur of motion, his arrows a constant, inescapable storm. He cut through entire legions of our soldiers, he bypassed the great Drona, he fought his way through the very heart of our defenses. But our army was vast, and as the sun began to dip low towards the western horizon, Jayadratha was still shielded, deep within the last ranks of our warriors. Hope began to rise in our camp like a fever. Despair began to fall upon Arjuna like a shroud. And then the sun set. A massive cheer erupted from our side of the field. Your son celebrated. Jayadratha, foolishly, came out from his hiding place, looking to the sky to mock Arjuna's failure. And in that single moment of arrogant relief, Krishna smiled. He lifted his hand, and the darkness that had covered the land dissolved. It had been a divine illusion, a trick of the light created by his Sudarshana chakra. The real sun was still hanging just above the horizon, blood-red and waiting. Jayadratha stared in absolute horror. And Arjuna, his aim swift and true, loosed the arrow that fulfilled his vow. In that moment, your son should have understood. He was not playing a game against his cousins. He was playing against God, and he could not win. The very laws of nature were being bent to ensure his defeat. Finally, the moment came. Karna and Arjuna. Their chariots faced each other on the bloody, corpse-strewn field. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath. For a time, they were perfectly, terrifyingly matched. A storm of celestial weapons erupted between them, their power scorching the earth and shaking the heavens. The sound of their bowstrings was the only sound left in the universe. Karna, with his infallible spear, the Vasvi Shakti, could have ended the duel in an instant, but he had been forced to waste that single-use weapon earlier on Bhima's demonic son, Gatotkacha. He was fighting with all his legendary skill, but fate, it seemed, had already stolen his deadliest weapon. And then the final curse took hold. A curse laid upon him years ago by a Brahmin whose cow he had accidentally killed. The earth itself, it seemed, rose up to claim its due. His chariot wheel, without warning, sank deep into the soft, bloody mud. He was a warrior whose entire life had been a desperate struggle against the circumstances of his birth. A man of supreme nobility branded as lowborn. And here, at the final, most crucial moment of his life, he was literally being dragged down by the dirt. He leaped from his immobilized chariot, helpless, trying to free the wheel, calling out to Arjuna across the field to respect the rules of combat and not strike a man who was disarmed and in distress. Arjuna hesitated. To strike a man in such a state, it went against his every instinct as a Kshatriya. But Krishna's voice was like ice in his ear, sharp and unforgiving. Where was this Dharma, Arjuna, when Abhimanyu stood alone and weaponless, surrounded by 7 of you? Where was this Dharma when Draupadi, a woman in her monthly course, was dragged by her hair into the assembly hall? Karna has been complicit in every one of Duryodhana's evil deeds. This is your moment. Fulfill your destiny. And so, with tears of sorrow for the man he had to kill streaming down his face, Arjuna raised his bow one last time. The arrow struck, and the great, the noble, the tragic hero Karna fell. The sun seemed to dim in the sky at his passing. That night, as the Pandavas were celebrating their victory, a weeping Kunti would finally confess the secret she had held in her heart her entire life. The great rival they had just killed, the man they had hated and feared above all others, was their brother. Their elder brother, born before her marriage to Pandu, cast away in a basket on the river. As he lay dying, with his chariot wheel stuck in the mud, he was not just Duryodhana's champion. He was Kunti's firstborn son. He was the rightful king of Indraprastha. He was the brother they had just slain. And in that moment of revelation, the Pandavas' great victory turned to ash in their mouths. After Karna's fall, the war was a ghost of itself, a final, twitching death spasm. It was simply a matter of cleaning up the dead. Your son, Duryodhana, the last of your 100 to still draw breath, finally fled the field in terror and hid himself at the bottom of a lake, using his yogic powers to survive beneath the water. But they found him. They taunted him, calling him a coward, until his pride forced him to surface. And there, on the shore of that lake, Bhima, his face a mask of grim, 13-year-old satisfaction, faced him one last time, mace to mace. The duel was brutal, savage, the final, ugly punctuation to a bloody epic. And in the end, ignoring the established rules of mace fighting that forbid striking below the waist, Bhima did exactly what he had sworn to do 13 years earlier in that hall of shame. He swung his mace with all his God-given might and shattered your son's thighs. He left him there, on the field, broken and dying, a king of nothing but his own agony. And so I brought you the news. One by one, I recounted the deaths of all your sons. I told you of Ashvathama's horrific night raid on the sleeping Pandava camp, a final act of vengeance so vile it earned him a curse of eternal, lonely suffering from Krishna himself. I told you of the final, horrifying tally, 18 days of war, millions of men dead. Of the great Kuru army, only 3 of us remained. I have told you the story as you asked, my king. From the promise to the pyre, Yudhishthir was crowned king. He ruled justly for 36 years, they say. He performed the great horse sacrifice to cleanse the sins of the war. He brought a kind of peace to the wounded land. And after many years, when their time on this earth was done, he and his brothers and their queen walked north, towards the great Himalayas, on their final journey to the heavens. It is a fine story for the bards to sing, a story of righteous kings and their final, just reward. But that is their story. It is not ours. Our story ended on that bloody field, with the last, gurgling breath of your last son. You sit now on the throne of Hastinapura. But what is it you rule? The Pandavas gave you reverence. They gave you comfort in your old age. They allowed you to keep the hollow illusion of kingship. But you are a king of ghosts, a ruler of memories. And they rule now, my king, from a throne built on the bones of our children. They found their heaven. And you and I, we are left here, in this echoing silence, to rule over their ghosts. You wanted to know the precise moment the rot set in. It was every moment you chose your son's insatiable ambition over your brother's simple justice. Every moment you chose silence when a king should have roared. Every moment you were blind not in your eyes, but in your heart. Was it worth it, my king? Was the throne worth this emptiness?